Imagine waking up every day knowing you don't own your body, your time, or even your name. You're not a citizen, not a warrior, not even a person in the eyes of the law. You're just property. Welcome to ancient Rome, where millions lived and died as slaves, the invisible backbone of a vast empire built on cruelty and exploitation. Slavery in Rome wasn't just about hard labor, it was a brutal system designed to crush your spirit, break your will, and erase your identity. From grueling fields to dark mines, from the glare of the Colosseum to the cold halls of patrician mansions, Roman slaves faced unimaginable hardships every single day. They were whipped, sold, abused, and punished without mercy. Their lives were disposable, their dreams crushed before they could even form. But it wasn't just physical torment. Roman slavery invaded every corner of a person's existence: family, freedom, even hope. Some fought back, some prayed, but most simply endured. So buckle up as we dive deep into the harsh, savage reality of life as a Roman slave. Spoiler alert, it was brutal, and it's a story you absolutely need to hear. You arrive in ancient Rome, a city that's bustling, loud, and filled with people from every corner of the known world. It's the beating heart of an empire so vast it stretches from the misty hills of Britain to the sun-soaked sands of Egypt. The marble statues and grand temples look impressive, the markets overflow with exotic goods, and everywhere you turn there's a buzz of life and power. But for millions living here, Rome isn't a place of opportunity, it's a cage. If you weren't born free or lucky enough to be a Roman citizen, your fate was simple and brutal. You were a slave. Slavery wasn't a fringe or accidental part of Roman life. It was the foundation on which the empire was built. It powered the economy, filled the army's kitchens, cleaned the patrician mansions, and built the roads. Slaves were everywhere, and most Roman citizens didn't even blink at it. In fact, they depended on the unpaid labor of slaves to live their luxurious lifestyles. How did people become slaves? Sometimes it was the aftermath of war. Rome was constantly conquering new territories, and every battle came with a grim bonus: captives. Men, women, and children were rounded up and sold like cattle at bustling slave markets. Other times, you were born into slavery. Children inherited the status of their mothers, condemned to the same brutal life. Debt was another trap. If a Roman citizen couldn't pay his debts, he or his family could be enslaved. Even criminals could be sentenced to slavery. Slavery in Rome wasn't about race or ethnicity. Slaves came from all over the empire: Gauls, Greeks, Africans, Syrians, Britons, and even fellow Italians. The one thing they shared was total loss of freedom. Here's the cruel reality: slaves had no legal rights. They were considered property, res in Latin, which literally means things. If your master wanted to sell you, beat you, or kill you, that was his right. Roman law protected the property owner, not the person who was enslaved. What did this mean day to day? It meant you woke up each morning knowing your life was not your own. Your future was decided by your master's whims. If you were lucky, your master was reasonable, and you worked in a household or on a small farm. If you were unlucky, well, there was a whole spectrum of brutal jobs waiting for you. Rower in a warship, laborer in the fields under a scorching sun, slave in a dangerous mine, or even a gladiator forced to fight for your life in the arena. Slaves couldn't legally marry. Any children they had belonged to the master and were born into slavery. Families were constantly at risk of being separated. Wives sold to distant estates, children given away, parents broken apart. There was no protection from this. Slaves were seen as assets, to be bought and sold like livestock. Despite this, slaves often tried to maintain some semblance of normal life. They formed friendships, created small communities, celebrated religious festivals, and sometimes even learned to read or develop skills that made them more valuable. But beneath this fragile veneer of humanity was a harsh truth. Their bodies, their minds, and their very souls were owned by someone else. If you were caught trying to escape, the punishment was horrific. Masters and Roman authorities made brutal examples of runaways: whipping, mutilation, or death by crucifixion or worse. Escape wasn't just dangerous, it was often a death sentence. Yet the system was so vast and ruthless that most slaves had no real hope of freedom. Sure, some might be freed by their masters for loyalty or years of service, a process called manumission, but this was rare and came with many strings attached. Freed slaves still faced discrimination and struggled to survive in a society that saw them as forever marked by their past. Roman society was sharply divided by class and status, and slaves were at the absolute bottom. Citizens might discuss philosophy, politics, or arts while sipping wine at lavish banquets, but these conversations were held on the backs of millions of enslaved people whose sweat and suffering made it all possible. So the next time you admire the grandeur of Rome, its architecture, its military might, or its cultural achievements, remember that this empire's glory was soaked in the pain and blood of the enslaved masses. For the Roman slave, life was not just hard or unfair, it was utterly brutal from the moment they arrived in the city to their last breath. If you thought being a slave in ancient Rome just meant working hard, think again. The truth is far darker. Slaves had no rights whatsoever, not a single one. They were legally classified as property, things to be owned, bought, and sold. This meant their masters had complete control over their lives. Imagine waking up every day knowing that the law doesn't protect you. You can't own anything, marry, or even defend yourself if someone abuses you, because legally, you are the abuse. Roman law was crystal clear. A slave was not a person. No matter how intelligent or skilled you were, the law saw you as a tool or a piece of furniture. This was no accident. It was designed to keep the system running smoothly. Owners needed to be able to use, punish, and trade slaves without interference. Slaves could be punished brutally for any reason, or even no reason at all. A lazy day? Expect whipping. A mistake? More beating. An unlucky glance at your master? That might mean a severe punishment just to remind you who's in charge. There was no right to a fair trial, or to speak up in court. If a slave was accused of a crime, the master could decide their fate, usually not in the slave's favor. In fact, any slave who harmed a Roman citizen faced death, no questions asked. Even marriage was a joke. Slaves couldn't legally marry, and any children born to slaves automatically became their master's property. Families were constantly at risk of being torn apart if the master decided to sell one member away. Emotional bonds were ignored by the law, which saw family ties as irrelevant when it came to property. Some slaves lived in households and might develop personal relationships with their masters or mistresses, but these were dangerous illusions. Beneath any kindness was always the threat of punishment or sale. One day you could be trusted, the next day you could be sold to a brutal owner on the other side of the empire. This total lack of legal protection meant slaves were vulnerable not just to physical abuse, but also to exploitation. Sexual abuse was common and legal. Female slaves and sometimes male slaves were often forced into sexual servitude with no hope of escape or justice. Some slaves tried to improve their lives by gaining special skills, teaching, writing, or managing household tasks. This sometimes led to better treatment or even freedom. But no skill could protect a slave from the cruel reality: they were still owned by someone else. Even the smallest acts of independence, like learning to read, holding on to family memories, or saving money to buy freedom, were dangerous and often forbidden. Masters feared educated slaves because knowledge could inspire rebellion or escape. For many, the only hope was manumission, the legal process where a slave could be freed. But even freed slaves, called libertina, faced stigma, discrimination, and many legal restrictions. They were often tied to their former masters through debts or social obligations, and full equality remained out of reach. The Roman state itself enforced slavery laws with harsh penalties. Any slave who revolted or escaped faced severe torture or death. And slave owners who killed their slaves were almost never punished. The law protected property, not people. So what did this mean in real life? It meant living under constant fear of punishment, fear of separation from loved ones, fear of death. It meant a life where your hopes, your rights, your very identity were stripped away daily. For Roman slaves, life was a struggle for survival against an unbreakable system. This wasn't just physical hardship, it was a psychological and emotional torment designed to erase any spark of rebellion. If you think being a Roman slave meant just scrubbing floors or carrying water, think again. Slaves in ancient Rome did everything. And by everything, we mean everything, from the most grueling labor to the most delicate tasks, and usually under brutal conditions. Roman society was like a giant machine powered by slave labor. Without slaves, Rome simply wouldn't run. So what kind of jobs did slaves have? Spoiler, none were easy, and many were downright deadly. Field laborers, the backbone of Rome's agriculture. Most slaves worked on farms or large agricultural estates called latifundia. Here, slaves labored from dawn till dusk, tending crops like wheat, olives, and grapes. The work was backbreaking, planting, harvesting, and hauling heavy loads in the scorching sun or pouring rain. These slaves lived outdoors, often in rough huts with little food or medical care. The conditions were harsh because the masters didn't care about comfort, they cared about profits. A weak or sick slave was useless, but they were cheap to replace. If a slave collapsed from exhaustion or disease, the owner usually just bought another one. Domestic slaves, the invisible workforce. Other slaves worked inside the grand homes of Rome's elite. These domestic slaves were cooks, cleaners, tutors, hairdressers, secretaries, and even doctors or teachers. Though their work seemed less physically demanding, it came with constant pressure. They lived under the watchful eye of their masters and were expected to be perfect, because mistakes could mean whipping, imprisonment, or worse. Domestic slaves often had a precarious position. They might be treated better than field slaves, but their every move was monitored. Trust was a luxury few ever earned. They could be accused of theft or disobedience on a whim and punished harshly. The mine slaves, living in hell. One of the deadliest jobs for Roman slaves was working in the mines. These slaves were sent to dig precious metals like gold, silver, and copper. Mines were dark, damp, and toxic. Many slaves died quickly from accidents, lung diseases, or exhaustion. The mine slaves were treated so brutally that their life expectancy was shockingly short, sometimes only a few years. Because the Romans saw slaves as replaceable, little effort was made to improve their conditions. They were expendable tools in the empire's relentless quest for wealth. Rowers on warships, slaves on the front line. Another group of slaves had one of the toughest jobs imaginable, rowing Roman warships. These slaves sat chained to their benches, rowing for hours on end during naval battles or long voyages. They had no chance to rest and lived with constant threats of punishment for slowing down. Rowing was exhausting, dangerous, and humiliating. It was also a constant reminder of slavery's cruelty. Slaves were literally the engine of Rome's naval power. Gladiators, fighting for their lives. Some slaves were forced into a horrifying profession, gladiators. Trained to fight in the Colosseum, these slaves battled for the entertainment of Rome's crowds. Gladiators had a chance at fame, and sometimes even freedom if they survived long enough, but most died young. Life as a gladiator was a brutal mix of training, violence, and uncertainty. These slaves were weapons, bred and trained to kill or be killed. Their suffering was both spectacle and a grim reminder of Rome's cruelty. Sex slaves, bodies as property. Sexual exploitation was another horrific reality for many slaves. Female slaves, and sometimes male slaves, were forced into sexual servitude. They had no rights and no say in what happened to their bodies. This abuse was accepted as normal by Roman society. Some sex slaves lived in households and were forced into constant service for their masters or guests. Others were sold in slave markets explicitly for sexual purposes. This was one of the darkest, most brutal aspects of Roman slavery. What did this mean for the slaves? No matter the job, life was harsh and dangerous. Slaves were pushed to their limits physically and emotionally. Punishments for mistakes or disobedience were swift and cruel. Whippings, beatings, or worse. Slaves had no control over where they lived or worked. They could be sold and moved thousands of miles away with no warning. Families were torn apart, and any hope of a stable life was crushed. Yet, despite the cruelty, slaves tried to survive. Some learned trades, gained skills, and tried to earn their freedom. Others clung to small moments of dignity, quiet conversations, religious rituals, or secret acts of kindness. If you think your boss can be tough, just imagine owning a person, literally. In ancient Rome, masters had nearly unlimited power over their slaves. They were the law, the judge, and the executioner rolled into one. And spoiler alert, they were often ruthless. Roman masters came in all shapes and sizes, from wealthy senators living in marble palaces to small farmers running modest estates. But no matter who they were, one thing was consistent: slaves had no protection from abuse. Why were masters so brutal? At its core, slavery in Rome was about control. Masters needed to keep their slaves working hard and obedient. Fear was the cheapest and most effective tool for that. A whip, a threat, or a quick punishment was enough to remind a slave who was in charge. For many masters, slaves weren't even people. They were tools, investments, or sometimes just objects of annoyance. Beatings and punishments were everyday reality, and cruelty was often seen as a sign of good management. Whippings, beatings, and worse. The whip was the master's favorite weapon. Even minor mistakes, breaking a dish, arriving late, or saying the wrong thing, could lead to savage beatings. Sometimes masters punished slaves publicly, making an example to scare others into submission. But it wasn't just whippings. Slaves could be chained, locked up, or forced into humiliating tasks as punishment. Some were branded with hot irons or had body parts amputated as warnings. Yes, Rome had no shortage of horrific punishments designed to break both body and spirit. A bad day for a slave could mean death. If a slave was particularly disobedient or unproductive, the master could decide to kill them. Roman law didn't punish owners for killing their slaves, unless it was considered excessive. In practice, slaves could be killed for a bad mood or a minor offense. One famous example comes from the writer Seneca, who tells of a master killing his slave simply because the slave looked at him wrong. It's not just cruelty, it's absolute power without accountability. Masters had favorites, but don't get jealous. Some slaves were favorites of their masters and received better treatment, but that was a double-edged sword. Favorites were expected to be loyal and obedient beyond all others. They lived under constant scrutiny and risked harsh punishment if they disappointed their masters. The illusion of kindness was often a trap. Slaves had to be perfect or risk falling from grace into worse abuse. Masters could sell or separate families at will. Slaves were property to be bought, sold, or traded. This meant families were constantly at risk of being torn apart. A husband could be sold across the empire while his wife and children stayed behind, or vice versa. Masters didn't have to care about these human bonds. For them, it was just business. This caused immense pain for slaves who lived with the fear of losing their loved ones forever. Sometimes masters were smarter, but no less cruel. Not all masters were brute tyrants. Some were educated and even humane by the standards of the time. They might treat slaves with relative kindness or allow them limited freedoms. But even the nice masters still owned their slaves. No matter how benevolent, a master's power was absolute, and the threat of punishment or sale always loomed. Slaves' lives were always fragile. The master's role in the system. Masters weren't just individuals, they were part of a larger system. They depended on slavery to maintain their wealth, status, and power. Without slaves, Rome's economy and society would collapse. This created a brutal cycle. Masters needed slaves to work, but slaves needed to survive under masters. It was a relationship based on domination, fear, and control. Being a Roman slave wasn't just about working hard. It was about living under a constant cloud of fear. One wrong move, one small mistake, and you could find yourself at the mercy of punishments so harsh they'd make your skin crawl. For slaves, punishment was less about justice and more about control. A brutal reminder that their lives were owned and any defiance would be crushed without mercy. Whipping, the most common torture. If you think a spanking is bad, Try dozens or hundreds of lashes with a whip. Sometimes a whip tipped with metal or bone to tear the skin. Masters used whipping to punish laziness, disobedience, or even just bad luck. There was no limit to how many lashes a slave could receive. Some slaves were whipped until they bled or even died. It was a horrific daily reality. Public whipping was common. Imagine being stripped naked, tied up, and whipped in front of other slaves as a brutal warning. This could be you. The psychological terror was as crushing as the physical pain. Flogging and beatings. Besides whips, slaves could be beaten with rods, sticks, or fists. These beatings were often random and severe, sometimes lasting for hours. Masters or overseers could vent their anger or frustration with total impunity. Roman law allowed masters to punish slaves however they wanted. There was no court to defend the slaves' rights. Even minor mistakes could lead to brutal beatings. A broken pot, a scolding wasn't enough. You might get whipped or beaten. Branding, mutilation, and imprisonment. For slaves who tried to run away or commit serious offenses, punishment could be permanent. Some were branded with hot irons. A fiery mark burned into their skin as a lifelong stigma of their crime. This was a way to shame them and make future escape attempts easier to detect. In more extreme cases, slaves could be mutilated, having fingers cut off or ears sliced to mark them as criminals. These horrific punishments were intended to make slaves powerless and terrified. Imprisonment and chains. Sometimes punishment wasn't just about pain, but humiliation and control. Slaves could be locked up in tiny, dark cells or chained in painful positions for days or weeks. The psychological torment of isolation and helplessness was a form of punishment all its own. Rowers on warships were often chained to their benches, forced to row for hours without rest. The chains weren't just physical restraints. They were constant reminders that the slave had no freedom. Execution and death. If the master wanted to make an example or thought a slave was dangerous, execution was on the table. Slaves could be crucified, burned alive, or thrown to wild beasts in the arena. Death was a common punishment for rebellion, escape attempts, or even perceived disrespect. Some owners even executed slaves for trivial reasons, sometimes just because they were angry or frustrated. The law protected masters, not slaves, meaning killing a slave was rarely punished. The psychological toll. The punishments weren't only physical. Living with the constant threat of violence took a heavy toll on slaves' mental health. The fear of random beatings, public humiliation, or sudden sale created a constant state of anxiety. Slaves learned to live in silence, to hide their pain, and to obey without question. This psychological control was as effective as any whip. Punishment as a tool of control. Masters used punishment as a tool not just to discipline, but to break spirits. A whipped slave was less likely to rebel, escape, or resist. The brutal system relied on fear to keep millions of people obedient. But despite this, slaves resisted whenever they could, through small acts of defiance, secret communications, or even open rebellions. Punishments were the cruel backbone of the Roman slavery system, designed to keep slaves powerless and scared. In a world where slaves were treated like property and punished like animals, it might seem impossible that anyone would dare fight back. But history tells us that Roman slaves did rebel. Sometimes quietly, sometimes violently, they risked everything to say, enough. Slave rebellions weren't everyday events. They were dangerous and rare because the stakes were life or death. But when they happened, they shook Rome to its core. The biggest slave rebellion in history, the Third Servile War. Most people have heard of Spartacus, the gladiator who led one of the most famous slave uprisings in Roman history. Between 73 and 71 BCE, Spartacus, along with thousands of escaped slaves, fought against Rome's armies in what's known as the Third Servile War. Spartacus was a former gladiator and soldier who escaped a gladiator training school with about 70 others. From there, the rebellion grew into a massive force, tens of thousands of slaves rising up to challenge the empire.
This was more than just a fight for survival. It was a demand for freedom and dignity. The rebels won several battles against Roman legions, terrifying the Roman elite. But despite their bravery and skill, Spartacus and his followers were ultimately defeated. The aftermath was brutal. Thousands of slaves were crucified along the Appian Way as a terrifying warning to others. Other rebellions and everyday resistance. Spartacus's revolt was the largest, but there were other rebellions, both big and small. Some involved hundreds of slaves, others just dozens. Many slaves resisted in quieter ways too, sabotaging equipment, stealing food, or fleeing. Slaves sometimes formed secret networks to communicate, share news, or plan escapes. These acts of defiance may seem small, but they were powerful statements of resistance in a system built to erase their humanity. Why rebellions were so dangerous? Rebelling was a gamble with everything to lose. If caught, slaves faced torture, execution, or even more severe punishment for their families and friends. The Roman state responded to rebellions with overwhelming force, crushing uprisings with brutal efficiency. Masters feared rebellions more than anything. They increased surveillance, tightened controls, and used fear to discourage any thought of revolt. The impact of rebellions. Even though rebellions were mostly crushed, they left a lasting impact. They exposed the cracks in Rome's mighty system and reminded everyone, slaves and masters alike, that slaves were human beings with a desire for freedom. The stories of Spartacus and other rebel slaves inspired hope, fear, and debate about the morality of slavery throughout Roman history and beyond. For many Roman slaves, the dream of freedom was a flickering light in a dark world. While most slaves lived their entire lives in bondage, some were lucky or skilled enough to gain manumission, the official process of being freed by their masters.
But freedom in ancient Rome was complicated, limited, and came with strings attached. What was manumission? Manumission was the legal act by which a slave became a libertus, freedman, or liberta, freedwoman. Freed slaves were no longer property. They could own property themselves, marry legally, and engage in business. On paper, it seemed like a great reward. But this freedom wasn't absolute. Freedmen owed patronage to their former masters, now their patrons. This meant they were still tied by obligations, often expected to work or provide services to their old owners. It was a relationship blending freedom and control. How could slaves become freed? There were a few main ways. Manumission by the master's will. Masters sometimes freed slaves in their wills, often as a reward for loyal service. Manumission by purchase. Some slaves could save money, called peculium, to buy their freedom. But this was rare, since earning and saving was extremely difficult. Manumission by official ceremony. Some slaves were freed through formal public ceremonies, manumissio vindicta, or imperial grants. Even freed slaves could remain socially inferior to freeborn Romans. They often faced prejudice and limited opportunities. Why would masters free their slaves? It might seem strange, but there were good reasons. Loyal or talented slaves were valuable assets, and freeing them could reward service or encourage loyalty. Freed slaves could also become clients who supported their former masters' political careers or businesses. Sometimes, freeing slaves helped families remain intact. Freed slaves could marry legally and raise children with some security. The reality for freedmen. Even after manumission, life was tough. Freedmen were not full citizens. Many couldn't hold public office or serve in the military. They were often limited to certain jobs, like trade or crafts. Their children, however, were born free and could eventually rise in society, sometimes reaching impressive status. Risks and downsides. Manumission was not a guarantee of safety. Freedmen could be re-enslaved if they broke laws or offended their patrons. Plus, many former slaves lived in poverty or faced discrimination. Also, slaves who were freed late in life had fewer chances to build new lives. Some remained stuck in roles serving their former masters. Manumission in numbers. By the late Republic and early Empire, manumission became more common. Freed slaves and their descendants formed a significant part of Roman society, adding layers to the complex social fabric of Rome. Becoming free was a huge milestone for Roman slaves, but freedom wasn't a magic fix.
For freed slaves or liberti, life opened up new possibilities, but also a new set of challenges. Imagine escaping the chains only to find yourself navigating a society that still viewed you as less than and put plenty of obstacles in your path. The double-edged sword of freedom. When slaves were freed through manumission, they gained legal rights. They could marry, own property, run businesses, and pass inheritance to their children. But socially, freedmen remained in a gray zone. Many free Romans looked down on them, calling them novi homines, new men, or even worse. Freedmen were officially free, but not fully accepted. The Roman elite often treated them like second-class citizens, and their social status was often fixed, hard to rise above their past. The patron-client relationship. Freedom also came with strings attached. Freed slaves became clients of their former masters, now their patrons. This relationship was a mix of gratitude, obligation, and dependence. Freedmen owed respect and sometimes services or payments to their patrons. This wasn't exactly independence, more like a complicated form of loyalty that lasted for life. In some cases, this relationship was mutually beneficial. Patrons gained political support and business help, while freedmen received protection and opportunities. But the balance was delicate, and patrons held a lot of power. Work and economic life. Many freedmen entered trades or crafts, becoming bakers, merchants, or artisans. This was often their best shot at making a living. Some became quite successful, especially if they had skills or education learned during slavery. But many others struggled. Without family wealth or status, freedmen faced economic hardships. Their path was uphill, with little safety net. They had to work hard just to survive,
let alone thrive. The children of freedmen. The children of freed slaves were born free and had full citizenship rights. This was one of the most hopeful aspects of manumission, the possibility of social mobility for future generations. Some families rose to prominence within a few generations. Freedmen's descendants could become senators, priests, or wealthy landowners, a remarkable turnaround from their ancestors' harsh beginnings. Identity and stigma. Despite these gains, freedmen often struggled with their identity. Were they slaves or free citizens? Many lived in communities of other freed slaves, sharing a collective experience of marginalization. Culturally, they often blended Roman traditions with elements of their own backgrounds. Freedmen could be proud of their new status while still remembering the hardships they endured. Examples of success. History records a few freedmen who achieved remarkable success. For instance, the famous orator and statesman Cicero's father was a freedman. Some freedmen became wealthy businessmen or patrons of the arts, carving out respected roles in Roman society. The limits of freedom. Even with all these opportunities, the shadow of slavery often lingered. Freedmen could be re-enslaved if they broke laws or failed to meet obligations. They were vulnerable to prejudice and discrimination throughout their lives. Behind the brutal hardships and endless labor, Roman slaves were human beings with hearts, hopes, and families. Family life was complicated and fragile under slavery, but it was also a source of comfort and resistance. For slaves, holding on to family bonds was a small act of rebellion against a system designed to tear them apart. Slaves could marry, but not legally. Slaves often formed relationships and married each other in unofficial ceremonies known as contubernium. These unions were based on mutual commitment but had no legal standing. The Roman state did not recognize slave marriages, so these relationships offered little protection. Because slaves were property, their masters could separate couples at will. Husbands, wives, and children could be sold to different owners, scattered across the empire, and rarely reunited. Families could be broken apart at any time. One of the cruelest realities of Roman slavery was the constant threat of family separation. A slave family might live together one day and be split apart the next. Masters sold slaves like livestock with no regard for their relationships. Parents feared losing children, spouses feared losing each other. This created deep emotional scars, but slaves did what they could to keep families intact. Children born into slavery. Children of slaves were automatically slaves themselves, no matter who the father was. Even if a child's father was free, the child's status followed the mother's.
This kept the slave population steady and prevented slaves from gaining rights through descent. For slave parents, raising children in this harsh world was heartbreaking and dangerous. Children worked from a young age, often separated from parents for labor or sale. Family as resistance. Despite the dangers, family ties were powerful. Slaves found ways to maintain relationships, exchanging letters, gifts, or messages through trusted intermediaries. Family was a source of strength, motivation, and hope. Some slaves risked everything to buy the freedom of family members or petitioned masters to keep families together. Slave communities and networks. Slaves often lived and worked among others from similar backgrounds or regions. These communities could form their own social networks, sharing stories, traditions, and support. This sense of community was a lifeline. It helped slaves survive the loneliness and trauma of bondage. Freedmen families. When slaves were freed, many sought to rebuild or reunite their families legally. Manumission gave them rights to marry and raise children as free citizens. For freedmen, family was also a way to pass down identity and social status. The next generation had the chance to live free and climbed the social ladder.
Slaves weren't just servants. They were the driving force behind Rome's economy. From vast farms to busy workshops, from sprawling households to dangerous mines, slaves worked relentlessly to keep the empire running. But life on the job was grueling, exhausting, and often deadly. Agricultural slaves, toiling under the sun. Most slaves worked on farms, known as latifundia, sprawling estates owned by wealthy Romans. These farms produced grain, olives, wine, and other essentials that fed the empire. Agricultural labor was backbreaking. Slaves woke up before dawn to plow fields, plant seeds, tend crops, and harvest under the blazing sun. There was no downtime, only constant hard work, often in harsh weather. Owners cared more about the output than the people producing it. Malnourished, overworked, and exposed to the elements, agricultural slaves faced illness and injury daily. The work was exhausting, and the punishments for slacking off were brutal. Domestic slaves, the hidden workforce. Not all slaves worked in the fields. Wealthy Roman households had dozens or even hundreds of domestic slaves. These slaves cooked, cleaned, cared for children, managed the household's finances, and entertained guests. Domestic slaves had a better chance at slightly improved conditions, but lived under intense pressure. They had to be constantly available, perfectly obedient, and invisible when necessary. A single mistake could bring harsh punishment or dismissal. Gladiators and public slaves, life on display. Some slaves, especially captured soldiers or criminals, were forced to become gladiators, fighting in brutal combat for public entertainment. Their lives were short, violent, and extremely dangerous. Others served as public slaves in the city, cleaning streets, maintaining buildings, or working in workshops. These jobs were harsh and offered little protection. Mining slaves, the deadliest labor. Perhaps the worst jobs were in the mines. Slaves sent to work in silver, gold, or copper mines faced terrifying conditions. Underground tunnels with little light, poor air quality, and constant risk of cave-ins. Mining slaves were worked to death, their lifespan often measured in just a few years. Romans considered these slaves expendable, tools to be used until they died. Work conditions, no safety nets. There were no labor laws or protections for slaves. Injuries, exhaustion, or illness were part of the job. If a slave became useless, they could be sold or abandoned. Because slaves were property, owners often saw medical care as an investment, only if the slave could still work. Otherwise, slaves were left to suffer or die. Slaves' strategies to survive work. Slaves developed ways to cope, working together, sharing food, or secretly resting when possible. Some learned skills to gain favor with masters or improve their chances of manumission. But no matter how clever or strong, the physical toll of slave labor was immense. Life as a Roman slave was brutal and harsh, but slaves weren't broken. Even under the weight of chains and cruelty, they found ways to create moments of joy, build communities, and cling to hope.
Culture, faith, and social bonds became lifelines that helped slaves endure their daily suffering. Shared culture and traditions. Many slaves were brought from distant lands across the Roman Empire and beyond. They carried with them memories, languages, and traditions from home. These cultural ties were powerful sources of identity and resilience. Slaves often gathered secretly to share stories, songs, and customs. Maintaining these traditions was a form of resistance, an assertion of their humanity in a world that tried to erase it. Religion and spirituality. Religion played a crucial role for many slaves. While some were forced to adopt Roman gods, others kept their native beliefs alive or embraced mystery cults and new religions. Some slaves turned to gods like Isis or Mithras, who promised salvation and comfort. Others found solace in Christianity, which was growing during the later Roman Empire and preached equality and hope beyond this life. Faith gave slaves strength to endure suffering and hope for freedom, whether in this world or the next. Community and solidarity. Slaves often formed close-knit communities within households, workshops, or agricultural estates. These groups provided emotional support and practical help.
Through shared hardship, slaves built friendships and sometimes even surrogate families. They helped each other survive punishment, illness, or loneliness. Small acts of defiance. Even in community, slaves resisted their conditions through small but meaningful acts, sharing food, helping each other hide from overseers, or secretly practicing forbidden religions. These acts kept hope alive and reminded slaves that they were not alone. Entertainments and leisure. Slaves found moments of joy in music, dance, and storytelling. Festivals and religious celebrations were occasions to relax, bond, and express themselves. Though these moments were rare, they were vital for mental health and cultural survival. In the brutal world of ancient Rome, gladiators were both feared and admired. Slaves forced to battle each other in bloody contests for the entertainment of the masses. But behind the spectacle was a terrifying reality. Gladiators lived dangerous, short lives filled with violence, pain, and the constant threat of death. Who became gladiators? Most gladiators were slaves captured in war, criminals condemned to fight, or runaway slaves caught and forced into the arena. Some were volunteers seeking fame or money, but this was rare. Once a slave became a gladiator, their fate was sealed. They trained in harsh schools called ludi, under strict trainers called lanistae. These schools were prisons disguised as training centers, designed to shape fighters into deadly performers. Life in the gladiator school. Training was intense and brutal. Gladiators learned how to fight with different weapons and styles, from the heavily armed Murmillo to the nimble Retiarius with his trident. Despite harsh conditions, gladiators often formed bonds like brothers. They relied on each other for survival in a world that wanted to see them die. The gladiatorial games. Gladiator fights were major public events, held in amphitheaters like the Colosseum. Crowds cheered, jeered, and sometimes decided a defeated gladiator's fate with a thumbs up or thumbs down gesture, though the real signals were more complex. Fighting was often deadly. Some gladiators survived for years, becoming celebrities, while others died quickly in their first match. Life and death in the arena. Though gladiators were slaves, they sometimes earned rewards, gifts, or even freedom through victory. The promise of rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing freedom, motivated many fighters. But the cost was high. Injuries were common, medical care minimal, and death was always close. Gladiators lived with constant fear and adrenaline. Public perception. Romans loved the games. They were a mix of sport, politics, and religion. But beneath the cheers was a grim truth. These fighters were slaves, risking their lives as entertainment. Legacy of gladiators. The story of gladiators remains one of the most vivid symbols of Roman slavery's brutality. It's a reminder of the extremes slaves endured and the paradox of fighting for freedom in a deadly spectacle. When we think about Roman slaves, images of hard labor and brutal punishments often come to mind. But female slaves faced a unique set of challenges and dangers. Their lives were shaped not only by slavery's cruelty, but also by gender roles, exploitation, and constant threats that men did not always experience.
Yet despite everything, many women showed incredible strength and resilience. Roles of female slaves. Female slaves worked in households, farms, workshops, and even as entertainers. Their duties included cooking, cleaning, childcare, weaving, and sometimes more dangerous or degrading tasks. Many served as wet nurses or caretakers, trusted with the most intimate responsibilities. However, their vulnerability was high. They were often the first targets of abuse. Sexual exploitation. One of the darkest aspects of female slavery was sexual exploitation. Female slaves were at the mercy of their masters and could be forced into sexual servitude without any legal protections. Sexual abuse was widespread, and children born from these abuses were often slaves themselves, continuing the cycle of bondage. Childbirth and motherhood. For enslaved women, childbirth was risky. They gave birth without proper care, often under brutal conditions. Despite this, many women risked everything to care for their children and protect them from being sold or separated.
Motherhood was a source of both joy and fear. Enslaved mothers faced the constant threat of losing their children. Resistance and survival. Despite oppression, female slaves resisted in subtle ways, through secret gatherings, preserving cultural traditions, or covertly supporting others. Some women managed to earn manumission or find ways to improve their status, though this was much harder for women than men. Female freed women. Freed female slaves faced ongoing challenges, but also had opportunities to build families and businesses. They played key roles in Roman society as midwives, shopkeepers, or artisans. Their stories show a complex mix of vulnerability and power, survival and ambition. Life as a Roman slave was dominated by fear of punishment, brutality, and the harshest consequences for even the smallest mistake. The Roman system of slavery relied heavily on terror and discipline to keep slaves in line, reminding them daily who held the power. The role of punishment. Punishment was the main tool used by masters to enforce obedience. Slaves could be beaten, chained, branded, or whipped for disobedience, laziness, or attempting escape. These punishments were often public, designed to humiliate and serve as warnings to others. Owners had nearly absolute authority. A slave had no legal rights, and punishments could be severe or even fatal. Types of punishment. Physical abuse. Beatings with rods or whips were common. Some slaves were tortured for minor infractions. Branding. Masters sometimes branded slaves with marks showing ownership or punishment history. Chains and shackles. Slaves caught trying to run away were chained or imprisoned. Execution. In extreme cases, rebellious slaves faced execution without trial. Forced labor as punishment. Punishments could also include harsher work assignments, like sending slaves to the deadly mines. Fear as a control mechanism. Fear wasn't just about physical pain, it was psychological. Masters used punishment to break the spirit, discouraging rebellion or escape. Public punishments served as terrifying reminders to the entire slave community. Slave revolts and repression. Despite the fear, slaves sometimes rebelled. The most famous was Spartacus's revolt, which shook Rome but was brutally crushed. In response, Rome increased harsh measures to deter future uprisings, making life even more dangerous for slaves. Surviving the system. For slaves, survival meant constant vigilance, obedience, and trying to avoid punishment. Many accepted their fate, but some resisted in small ways to preserve dignity and hope. Roman slavery was a brutal system that shaped the lives of millions for centuries. It was a world of hardship, cruelty, and survival, but also one of resistance, hope, and transformation. As we close this story, it's important to reflect on what this dark chapter in history teaches us about power, humanity, and resilience. Slavery's central role in Rome. Slavery was the backbone of the Roman economy and society. It fueled agriculture, industry, entertainment, and even politics. Without slaves, the empire as we know it would not have existed. But this system came at a human cost.
millions suffered under chains, stripped of freedom, dignity, and often life itself. The human spirit amid oppression. Despite the harshest conditions, slaves were not just victims. They were people who fought to maintain family, culture, and hope. Whether through secret rituals, small acts of rebellion, or the pursuit of freedom, they showed remarkable strength. The stories of freedmen rising to prominence remind us that even in chains, the human spirit strives to break free. The paradox of Roman slavery. Roman slavery highlights a cruel paradox. A society that valued law, culture, and civilization depended on widespread oppression and dehumanization. This contradiction is a powerful reminder to question systems of power and injustice in our own times. Legacy in modern thought. Roman slavery influenced legal and social ideas for centuries. Understanding this past helps us see the roots of concepts like citizenship, rights, and freedom. It also challenges us to recognize and fight modern forms of slavery and exploitation still present today. Remembering the forgotten. Most slaves left no names or stories in the historical record. Remembering their lives honors their suffering and resilience. Their legacy teaches us empathy and the importance of justice.